Votre Excellence,
Excellencies, President of the Republic of Djibouti,
Ladies and gentlemen, en premier lieu,
first and foremost, before we get going, I would like to express the following. And that is my deep gratitude to the Djibouti government, and more specifically to His Excellency, the President of the Republic of Djibouti, Mr. Ismail Omar Spin Mazluli, for his vision, for his determination, for his commitment that is indeed necessary to host us all here today at the third International Summit on Balanced and Inclusive Education. And of course, I also need to thank the various members and ministers of governments here among us today. And of course, specifically, I want to thank the National Minister of Education and the Ministers of Higher Education. Along with all members of governments who mobilized themselves in order to ensure that this summit could be successful. Djibouti deserves this. All of us here are hoping for that too. And indeed, our world needs it.
over the past few days, I have sought to summon the words required, the words appropriate to address this assembly. I have sought to redact an opening speech which would serve and be worthy of this assembly. An assembly of women and men of the necessary inclination, of the sufficient conviction, of the required determination to travel for days on end, to convene for fewer days than it has taken them to reach and return from the Republic of Djibouti, and with the sole purpose of transforming elusive ideals into palpable reality. And for those that are familiar with my interventions, it will come at a surprise, and I doubt not, to some degree of relief, that I have failed in summoning the words required. For I can conceive of no vocabulary in any language that I know which would not fail me in seeking to reflect and convey the true extent of my respect, of my admiration, and of my awe. I therefore ask, ladies and gentlemen, for your kind and generous indulgence and forgiveness with the imprecise nature of my speech. For the point, after all, is that we are here. We are finally here at the third Forum BIE 2030. The International Summit on Balanced and Inclusive Education has finally begun. But whilst this summit is being held, it is an unfortunate truth that the world is undergoing most difficult moments, not too dissimilar from the challenge we must face together. As the world is being shaken by forces of disunion, of disjunction, we must have the courage and the fortitude, collectively, to overcome our individual interests in favor of those of the collective. For we are all too aware, here assembled, of the transgenerational nature of our struggle. For what is education? What is education, ladies and gentlemen, but the instrument of the unwavering promise that a better world is not only possible, but also, but especially inevitable. For what is the point of a summit such as this one, if not to contribute a verse to the powerful play of humanity? For what is the purpose of the sum of our influences, our positions, our roles, if not to deconstruct the invisible barriers and walls of which we unconsciously benefit and that hinder the marginalized, the excluded, the oppressed from achieving their self-empowerment? And there is, ladies and gentlemen, no generosity in dismantling those walls. It is merely the fulfillment of our duty of justice and international solidarity. And whilst this collective consciousness has brought us together here today, we must also beware in that education can, as well, be the instrument to preserve the status quo, reproducing it endlessly with all its injustices. For there is, ladies and gentlemen, no education that is socially neutral, no education that is neutral in terms of justice. Education is either transformative and emancipatory, or an industrial factory reproducing it with all its injustices. The transformative power of education, of which we are all here convinced, in fact, is only true insofar as education, is itself transformed. For education, ladies and gentlemen, exists within a historical, an international, a national, and a socio-economic context. It is, therefore, shaped by forces of the present, whilst paradoxically bearing the promise of the future. And the means to resolve this paradox is not to speak of educational reform for the sake of educational reform. We must first envision the future to which we aspire, to design the education which may give birth to it, and in doing so, simultaneously ensure, accordingly, that the forces shaping education are indeed those of justice. For in the 21st century, we can no longer settle for the imperial, industrial, one-size-fits-all model of education, which does not recognize the challenges of our planetary era, which is blind to national priorities and disdain local realities. With the aspiration of prosperous, equitable, and sustainable development, we can no longer condone education systems which, under the disguise of egalitarian standards, merely reproduces inequality through its intrinsic inequity. The future to which we aspire collectively is one which can only be served by an education which steps beyond the idea of inclusivity as mere access to an education. The future to which we aspire collectively is one which can only be served by an education which embraces inclusivity as an indivisible triumvirate, an indissoluble combination of access to an education. holistic, humanistic, and progressive social policies, and perpetual novelty in curricula, content, and pedagogy. Access, ladies and gentlemen, because there is no inclusion where there is no protection of the right nor the means to get an education. Holistic, humanistic, and progressive social policies. Because education and policies in education do not exist in a vacuum, and without a socio-political and international environment enshrining the human and the process of learning at the center of its social contract, it is vain to aspire for an education which benefits more than the privileged few. Perpetual novelty in curricula, content, and pedagogy. Because an education system that is severed from the people it pretends to educate, oblivious of national priorities, and contemptuous of local aspirations and realities, is no longer education, but rather undeniable alienation. For in the words of the great Brazilian educator, Paulo Freire, one cannot expect positive results from an educational or political action program which fails to respect the particular view of the world held by the people. Such a program constitutes cultural invasion. Good intentions, ladies and gentlemen, good intentions notwithstanding. We are, of course, told to be patient, that the world has changed a step at a time. But this assembly, ladies and gentlemen, is an assembly of the impatient. This is an assembly of the revolted, of the intransigent in their determination to never settle for good enough. José Martí, the Cuban national hero, wrote that los hombres van en dos bandos, los que aman y fundan, y los que odian y deshacen. Men belong to one of two groups: those who love and found, and those who hate and unmake. And this assembly, ladies and gentlemen, this assembly belongs to the group of those who love and make. It is an assembly of sculptors, constructors, creators. But first and foremost, in order to sculpt, in order to construct, in order to create, this is an assembly of iconoclasts, of dismantlers, of demolishers. An assembly engaged in the struggle of unmaking the unjust power dynamics which exist within the very education systems which bear the false promise of equality and prosperity for all. And we do so, ladies and gentlemen, we do so to construct a future to which we can collectively aspire and which we most certainly deserve. And this collective consciousness is also why we are too keenly aware that we have little merit. The true merit lies, ladies and gentlemen, with the teachers who struggle daily to overcome all obstacles in order to fulfill their moral obligation towards the next generations. The true merit lies with the next generations who struggle daily to assert their right to more than mere access to an education, but also who struggle to benefit from that same education, that struggle daily to assert their right to more than mere alphabetization, for they struggle also and especially to recognize themselves within their education. To paraphrase José Revueltas, these students do not study with the objective of accumulating static knowledge without any human content. Their cause as students is that of militant knowledge, critical knowledge, which challenges, contradicts, refutes, and transforms, revolutionizes the social, cultural, and scientific reality of the world. We claim, therefore, without any false modesty, no merit of our own, for we are here to proclaim our unwavering support to those who ought, but do not, claim any merit. And this support of ours, ladies and gentlemen, must take three forms. First, we must articulate a common language, defining our terms, that we may be able to achieve constructive dialogue and exchange, rather than remain condemned to deaf monologues crossing each other. We must define our understanding of quality, of equity, of inclusivity in education, whilst being firm in our position that true quality, true equity, and true inclusivity are always, of course, but most importantly, are always, of course, universal, but most importantly, always pertinent and adapted to the national, local, and individual contexts. Second, we must develop clear strategies and make concrete commitments, acknowledging our moral obligation to do so, to transform, to overhaul our education systems towards balance and inclusivity, ensuring that we do not merely seek to include more people in our education systems, but achieve the construction of systems which make sure that exclusion is impossible. And finally, recognizing that merely enacting cosmetic alterations is insufficient for educational transformation, which is a necessary investment in the future of our nations and the world to achieve social cohesion, justice, equity, and prosperity, as well as sustainability. We must abandon fragmented interventions in favor of systemic approaches. This implies an important mobilization of human, technical, and financial resources, which are otherwise allocated to the existing system. We must, therefore, create platforms and instruments putting in common human, technical, and financial resources on the basis of true solidarity, condition sine qua non for our collective survival, building genuine, efficient, mutually beneficial partnerships amongst equals. This is the purpose of this summit, ladies and gentlemen. This is the reason heads of state and governments, government ministers, academic bodies, and civil society organizations from Asia and the Pacific, Latin America and the Caribbean, and Africa have met today and will meet over the next 2 days. For in the era in which we know scientifically, with the advent of the climate crisis, that our development models are not only profoundly inequitable, but also intrinsically damaging to the planet, and by extension, our own interests and aspirations for development, it has become quintessential to find, to construct, to forge an alternative, equitable, prosperous, and sustainable way of development that is truly inclusive of all. And this can only be sparked by and through transforming our education systems and overhauling the dynamics through which they exchange and cooperate internationally. This summit knows that it is long overdue, ladies and gentlemen. It is long overdue that our education systems, the international dynamics that support them, and the instruments at their disposal not only serve the sustainable development of our societies, led by our national policies and supported by international platforms, but also, if not more importantly, serve to give long overdue birth to humanity's humanity. We are conscious, accordingly, that this must be done from the global south, by the global south, but in this era, for the entirety of humanity. And this is an opportunity which we must not fail to grasp. We must not fail to grasp, ladies and gentlemen, because with the opportunity comes the equal responsibility, which we cannot fail towards either. And as this tricontinental summit unfolds, as experiences are shared, as arguments convince, as ideals are concretized, we must not, for we cannot forget that the clock is ticking. And history, merciless a judge as it is being written. We are worthy of this challenge, but only if we dare to act together and strive for the impossible, for the possible has already been done. We must either forge the future, ladies and gentlemen, or allow ourselves to be forged by it. The choice is clear. Our presence here today is answer enough. From there on, we collectively move ahead today and every day to come. Our journey, ladies and gentlemen, has just begun. Thank you very much.